It is my true pleasure to welcome you all to today's Chubb Lecture with our distinguished guest, Professor Alison Bechdel. My name is Michael Beth Dinkler, and I'm a professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at Yale Divinity School. But I'm really here because I'm also the head of college for Timothy Dwight College, which means that I have the honor of serving as the custodian of the illustrious Chubb Fellowship. I'll say a few words about the Chubb Fellowship momentarily, but first I'd like to ask that you please turn off your cell phones and refrain from taking any photographs so that we have no disruptions to today's program. We begin with the land acknowledgement. With a spirit of gratitude and humility, we acknowledge that today's Chubb Fellowship event takes place on traditional indigenous territories. This includes lands of the Mohegan, Quinnipiac, and other Algonquin-speaking peoples. We honor and pay respect to their peoples of past and present. For today's Chubb event, I'm grateful for the hard work of the Timothy Dwight College staff, our student aids team, and especially for the leadership of Associate Chubb Fellow Casey Mills. We are grateful, too, for those who have stewarded the Chubb Fellowship since its inception. The Chubb Fellowship program was established in 1936 through the generosity of Hendon Chubb, a graduate of the Yale class of 1895. In 1949, the Visiting Chubb Fellowship was established as the main means of achieving Mr. Chubb's goals, which were to support and encourage students interested in government and American public affairs. Since the establishment of the fellowship, we have welcomed 4 United States presidents to campus, as well as many other heads of state and political leaders from around the world. Over the years, we've expanded the Chubb Fellowship program to include highly accomplished national and international leaders from a range of fields and disciplines. Chubb Fellows have been Nobel and Pulitzer Prize winners, multiply decorated Olympians, world-renowned actors and activists, and more. All outstanding individuals whose experiences and leadership have inspired innovation and helped to define not only the challenges of our times, but how we might best address them. Above all, the Chubb Fellowship program seeks to engage the Yale and New Haven communities based on the principle that service to the public good is the highest calling to which any of us may aspire. With this quick description of the history and aims of the Chubb Fellowship, we are deeply honored today to have Alison Bechdel join the impressive list of Yale's Chubb Fellows. I'm guessing that if you're in this room, Alison Bechdel needs no introduction. She has become a living icon for many. Her landmark comic strip, Dykes to Watch Out For, which ran from 1983 to 2008, gained a cult following for its game-changing portrayal of American queer life in all of its richness, diversity, and complexity. In 1985, Dykes to Watch Out For also introduced the rule when a character said that she will only watch a movie if it has at least 2 women talking to each other about a topic other than men. Originally a joke, the Bechdel test has now become a shorthand way of illustrating the dramatic gender disparity that still exists in Hollywood today. Professor Bechdel's critically acclaimed graphic novels include her poignant coming-of-age memoir, Fun Home, published in 2006, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and won the Eisner, the most prestigious award in the comics industry, for best reality-based work. Fun Home also won the GLAAD Media Award for Outstanding Comic Book, the Stonewall Book Award for Nonfiction, the Publishing Triangle Judy Grahn Nonfiction Award, and the Lambda Literary Award. In October 2013, Fun Home was adapted for the theater by Lisa Kron and Janine Tesori And after capturing a string of awards during its off-Broadway run, it was named a 2014 finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. The musical made its Broadway debut in 2015 and went on to garner a dozen Tony Award nominations, ultimately winning for Best Musical, Best Actor, Best Direction, Best Book, and Best Score. I know that last spring, many of you attended, or perhaps were yourselves involved in, Yale College's undergraduate production of Fun Home here on campus. It was at that point that our savvy colleagues in the English department and Film and Media Studies program began to recruit Alison Bechdel to come teach at Yale. And I am delighted that we are now not only welcoming her as the Fall Chubb Fellow, but also celebrating her joining the faculty as professor in the practice at Yale. What an incredible privilege it is for all of us as the Yale and New Haven communities to learn from Professor Bechdel today and in the years to come. I want to close this introduction with a personal note. I myself discovered Alison's work at a painful time in my own life, and I know that I am not the only person in this room to have found solace in her remarkable combination of wisdom and wit, humor and gravitas. She's able to wrap both word and image around the human condition in such a way that even within the stunning specificity of our individual experiences, we find that we are never alone. That is the magic of true art. Please join me in welcoming Alison Bechdel to the podium to deliver her Chubb lecture.
Wow, that Professor Bechdel gets me every time. Isn't that crazy? I don't even have an MFA. Shouldn't have said that. Thank you all so much for coming. This is an extremely great honor. I can't even look at that list of those other Chubb Fellows. It's crazy. All right, let's just start, shall we? I'm going to be showing you pictures because I'm a cartoonist. Exactly 45 years ago, I had just transferred from a small college in Western Massachusetts to Oberlin College after failing to get into Yale. And then came that fateful day in November of 1979. I was a junior in college. I had just been browsing at the campus bookstore, something I did a lot of in those days. I was lonely, a new transfer student. Being entirely asexual, apolitical, and asocial, I hadn't made many friends yet. When I wasn't in class or at the bookstore, I was getting high and going to movies. My cinematic education would have been excellent if I could remember any of it. The drugs, the endless movie-going, the hours of browsing through books. I was trying desperately to distract myself from a truth that was slowly but surely struggling to the surface of my solitary, sex-starved soul. One of the books I happened to flip through that particular afternoon was about homosexuals, as I later noted in my journal. Various people were interviewed about how they had come to realize they were gay and what their lives were like. I read for a while. Then at my usual time, I left the bookstore and headed back to my dorm. My route lay across a large square park. I was near the middle when it happened. It was as if I'd crossed some invisible boundary. On the other side, things would never be the same. So this story goes on to describe the moment that I realized I was one of those people in the book. I was a homosexual too. It was an actual epiphany, a realization that just suddenly fell into place, fully formed, something I had always known on some level, but could now at last admit. And these panels I've been showing you are from a short autobiographical comic that I wrote when I was in my early 30s. It's a cartoon, obviously, but it's also comic in the usual sense. It was a very lighthearted, humorous take on my coming out experience that didn't really touch on the deeper, more painful truth of what was really happening in my life at that time. It would take me until I was almost 40 to start grappling with telling that story in my memoir, Fun Home. And when I would revisit this scene in greater depth, and as you can see in more accurate detail. In that earlier version, I was drawing the campus from memory, but by the early 2000s, Google image search had transformed my creative process. It was easy to find all kinds of reference photos. Plus, I had just gotten better at drawing, and that increased accuracy in drawing felt of a piece with the more in-depth storytelling I was now able to do as I looked back from this older vantage point. I was writing more seriously about the loneliness I felt, and also about the intensive private reading I was carrying on apart from my schoolwork, reading everything I could get my hands on about homosexuality. And I also wrote, I think, with more awareness of the thing that really saved me, the discovery of this community of people who were in the same boat, and the way that enabled me to come out to someone besides just myself, to become part of the world, the outside world, in a way that I hadn't before in my confused isolation. And I went on after graduating from Oberlin to plunge into that community more fully, after being rejected from Yale again as a grad student. And maybe I'm making a virtue of a necessity, but I've always felt kind of relieved that I did not get into the graphic design program here, because I'm pretty sure I would have just gone right over to the dark side and gone into advertising. Instead, I moved to New York City and I got a very different kind of education, one rooted in the thriving LGBTQ subculture of that time, which of course in those days was just the G. The L was only starting to get added in occasionally and grudgingly. And within a year or two of leaving college, oh shoot, I left that slide out. Why is that there? Within a year or two of leaving college, I started drawing this series of cartoons that I called Dykes to Watch Out For. This one says, Twyla is appalled to learn that Irene is a morning person. And again, this early work was pretty lighthearted and silly. I was just having fun. I didn't see people like me or my friends reflected anywhere in the culture, and I somehow felt a need to, almost a craving to see that. So I just started creating it myself. In the early 1980s, I wasn't addressing the people who thought we didn't exist or shouldn't exist. This was just for us, ourselves, to see ourselves. I wanted to tell the truth about my life. Though I did believe deep down that if people could just see us, how could they help but love us? So these early cartoons weren't overtly political in any way, but back then just getting out of bed in the morning as an out lesbian was sort of a political act, even a radical act. So showing these scenes of lesbians living their everyday lives was a kind of out there thing to do. And certainly not a promising career path. I didn't even know it could be a career. I was just doing this for fun. This was a time when most gay people were still in the closet, and 15 or 20 years before celebrities really started to come out publicly. So given that my entire existence was somewhat politicized, my work did eventually become more overtly political. I was starting to see connections between things. I had been this clueless, white, middle-class kid, but once I came out, I found myself expelled from that world. In fact, I wasn't even a feminist until I realized I was a lesbian. But that was clearly the logical next step, as I found myself no longer included in the system, but sort of shown the door and put outside. And while that was disorienting at first, I was pretty immediately grateful for it. It was amazing to suddenly have the perspective that afforded. You couldn't see how things worked when you were on the inside, but because it was just the air that you breathed. But from the outside, it was all suddenly revealed. It was like I'd woken up from a dream. And indeed, I was becoming woke. The way that word has been misappropriated of late is just evidence of how very deeply threatening it is to the powers that be when you can see what they're doing behind the curtain. I was starting to understand the way oppression works. In particular, I began to see all the myriad self-defense mechanisms that it involves. The people who wanted to preserve the system, to keep things the way they were, seemed to me to be employing one defense mechanism after another. The things you learn in Psych 101: denial, repression, rationalization, scapegoating, projection. And what they all have in common is that they're ways of lying, basically. But with my newfound woke X-ray vision, I was able to see right through these lies, even through the fundamental lie that America didn't lie, that America cared about the truth. But having X-ray vision had a downside. This is from that comic strip that Michael Beth mentioned, where the rule. Most of popular culture suddenly became lost to me. I couldn't even go to a movie anymore. But to make up for that, I had a very rewarding sense of mission. I felt like maybe what I was doing could change things a little bit. And looking back, I think it did. I was part of a huge movement of people fighting for visibility and legislative change, and the right to just exist openly as who we are. And now, 4 or 5 decades later, we've made more progress than I even hoped for as a young person. But in spite of all that progress, a lot of things have not changed at all. The Electoral College still needs to be abolished. And here's the next panel of that comic strip I wrote back in 1988. Not much progress on this front either. Here's another panel from 1987, back when we actually had a chance to stop global warming. And we might all officially be living in a Protestant police state soon if Trump wins this election and the Christian nationalists take power and turn the country into an autocracy. But let's pace ourselves. So looking back, there seemed to be a turning point around the year 2000 when the country had a crazy, extremely close election that got decided by the Supreme Court. I wonder what will happen if that situation arises again. And the ideological division that had always existed in this country suddenly started to widen. That's when the whole red state, blue state discourse started to take hold. And I was starting to recognize that I was living in a sort of bubble, though I didn't have that word for it yet. And I started making an effort to open up the world of my comic strip to include people who weren't all on the same side, like this character's dad. Actually, this was not my idea, but a friend of mine who's more like politically moderate. She was a great influence on me and thought this would make the strip richer, and I'm very grateful to her for having done that. I also introduced a young conservative character, a student at the university where my character Ginger taught. I was recently reminded of this scene when when the governor of Florida took over that small progressive school, New College, and turned it into a conservative school. That's exactly what he did. He fired the president and hired some businessman to replace her at twice the salary. Anyhow, this character, Cynthia, would eventually come out as a lesbian, which was harder for her in some ways than for her more liberal peers. But it was really interesting getting to know her and trying to understand this character. Like, why does she believe the things she does? It's not that she's mean-spirited. She really thinks that providing social services for people is bad for them, that it's immoral. And on the topic of morality, one thing you would hear a lot on the left at this time was that we were letting the right cast us as this bunch of decadent, depraved Satan worshipers. And the feeling was if we could only demonstrate that we were in fact deeply motivated by ethical and even spiritual principles, we could win them over. That never happened, of course, and it would eventually become clear that the right didn't really care at all about these things: faith, patriotism, respect for the military, rule of law, even minimally decent behavior. When Trump came along, they were happy to throw that all right out the window. It's been very satisfying recently to see Democrats finally finding a way to start reclaiming some of those things in a transformed kind of way since the Harris campaign started. But whether that will be enough remains to be seen. Another thing my comic strip tried to track with was the way that the LGBTQ movement itself was growing more conservative. The way our increased acceptance happened hand in hand with assimilation, with moving away from the more radical aims of the early gay liberation movement to a focus on marriage and just being like everybody else. This character in particular was always arguing against assimilation. Even as she acknowledges that it's complicated. And a few years later, it was only getting more complicated. In my 20s and 30s, when I was just starting out, I called myself and thought of myself as a lesbian cartoonist. I felt very committed to claiming that identification. To leave it out felt like hiding or falseness. I saw an older generation of gay and lesbian writers, people like Susan Sontag and Edward Albee, who either refused to come out or pointedly rejected that kind of labeling because to them it meant taking something away from their stature. Like, why would they want to marginalize themselves when they were considered serious American writers? And then at some point in the late 1990s, I was talking with the writer Sarah Schulman, and she was talking about wanting to be done with this lesbian writer business. Why shouldn't she be considered an American writer, she said. And that gave me a jolt. I was like, yeah, why not? And I realized that even though it had come from good intentions, thinking of myself as a lesbian cartoonist was also a way my very concept of myself had been colonized, which is the crazy double bind of a stigmatized identity. You're damned if you do constrain yourself to it, and damned if you dare not to. But I could feel a space in my brain starting to open up. And I did a short comic around this time called Oppressed Minorities to Watch Out For, where I was working some of this stuff out. So I stopped drawing the comic strip in 2008 when students here were all babies. That's so crazy to me that most of my career has happened before you were even born. But in 2008, things seemed to be headed in a positive direction. The Bush administration was on its way out. We were on the verge of Obama's election. And it seemed like a good time to retire the strip. It no longer felt quite as necessary as it once had. So I felt this sense of relief and hope, which I now see was profoundly mistaken and naive, given what has happened since then. But at the time, I had recently published this book, Fun Home, a memoir about my father, and it was unexpectedly successful, and I started getting pulled in a lot of new directions. I just didn't have the ability to keep doing the comic strip anymore. So this book centers on what happened when I came out to my parents during my junior year of college. We were a family that never talked about anything personal or intimate, which is why I was writing this to them in a letter instead of telling them in person. But I had had this profound realization about myself, which seemed to change everything, and I felt like it would be a lie of a mission to not tell them about it. I was still sort of a good Catholic. Plus, it seemed like this was also a way of separating from my parents at last, of declaring my independence from them. So here I am on the phone with my mom after she got that letter. I had not separated from my parents at all, but had gotten even more enmeshed with them by inadvertently stumbling onto a secret they had been maintaining over the course of their marriage. And a month later, I was home for spring break, and I had one very brief conversation in person with my father about all this. But a couple months after that, he was dead. And my mom felt pretty sure that his death had been deliberate, that he'd stepped in front of that truck. She had recently asked him for a divorce. And of course, I felt completely responsible for having set this whole chain of events in motion as I saw it. It was a lot to sort out. And over the years, I did a lot of that work on my own and in therapy, but I also felt for a long time that I really needed to write this story, to tell it publicly. Otherwise, it felt like I was just continuing to keep my family's secrets, both the secret of my father's sexuality and the secret that he'd killed himself. And that just felt viscerally wrong, especially when it was so clear to me that his death was the direct result of the sexual shame and secrecy that he had to live with. So I was quite young when I realized that I wanted to write about this. It was probably within a year of my father's death, when I was around 20. And I assumed that at that point that I would write this story in prose. I hadn't become a cartoonist yet, and even if I had, comics hadn't yet become a form that could hold that kind of story. Art Spiegelman's Mouse would change all that when it won the Pulitzer a decade later in 1992, but even then it took a long time for the literary establishment, for the culture in general, to let comics in the door. And also at age 20, I did not have the skill or psychological perspective to tell this story in any form. But the biggest impossibility of telling the story was that it meant I would have to negotiate with my mother about doing it, since I would be revealing things that affected her. And I couldn't imagine having that conversation with her. But over the years, the world changed. There was a big leap of progress for queer people, and public sentiment started shifting. And it started shifting around topics of mental health, too. It no longer seemed like such a terrible stigma to talk about my father's suicide. In fact, it all started to feel not just possible, but like this could be a constructive project. In fact, I'd had a very hard time accessing my grief for my father. And that too seemed connected to the secrecy and lies. Like, how can you mourn someone when no one was acknowledging who they really were or how they had actually died? So I had this strong sense that telling the truth about my dad would also help me to resolve my own stalled grief. Another thing I learned when I became woke in my youth was that the personal is political, that our private struggles are very often the result of larger societal forces, which is another truth that the system would rather we not see. The system would rather that people feel like everything is their own damn fault. You know, poverty, illness, addiction, it's all you. So this was quite a life-saving idea for me, a way to make sense of what had felt like a senseless private tragedy. My father's suicide, his closeted double life, I started to understand that these things were not just my shameful family secret, they were the result of attitudes and laws that pathologized and criminalized certain kinds of sexuality. In the book, I was able to put my dad in historical context and explore what it meant that he and I had grown up on opposite sides of this watershed moment of the Stonewall riots in 1969. Telling the story was a way of telling the truth on a personal level, exploring the pain and dysfunction of my family, but it was also a look at the bigger systemic picture of how gay people had been forced to stay hidden and the real toll that it took on people's lives. And interestingly, Fun Home crossed over to a wider audience than the smaller subcultural one that my comic strip had. And not only that, it got turned into a Broadway musical, as Michael Beth told you, which was a very strange experience. I didn't know much about musicals, really, when I agreed to this plan. And in the back of my head, I was sort of hoping they would discover it was impossible to do this, and they would just set it aside. But it wasn't. The playwright, Lisa Crone, and the composer, Janine Tesori, came together and grappled for a long time with how to do it, but eventually they did do it, and they ultimately made something really wonderful. I just want to show you something kind of funny. I'm going to play a brief video clip of an interview I did in 2008, which was when Lisa Crone was just starting to work on the musical. And I wasn't at all involved in the musical, in the development of that thing. I had signed away all my rights to have any creative say in it. Well, okay, I'm going to show you, I hope this audio works. I'm going to show you. It's ironic. Fun Home was a story, it's like that just was simmering in my head for 20 years, because ever since my father died when I was 19, I feel like the story of my father and me is very much a political story, because it's the story of two generations of gay people. My father was gay and I was, and we both grew up in the same little Pennsylvania town, and he killed himself and I became a lesbian cartoonist. What was really weird was, like, that was 2008. I was just doing this interview, and then a couple years later, I finally saw the first staged version of Fun Home, and now I'm going to show you a clip of that. This is from the Broadway version, not the early one that I saw.
Anybody home?
He wants more. Caption. My dad and I both grew up in the same small Pennsylvania town, and he was gay and I was gay, and he killed himself, and I became a lesbian cartoonist.
So I don't know, that's just a weird thing. It was so odd to see, it was this weird feedback loop. Lisa had obviously run across that interview and worked it into the play. But it's also a very strange line to pull off. Juxtaposing something so painful with something that seems slightly funny, and is also sort of an in-joke. But I love that Lisa saw this was the gist of the whole story, the reason it was worth telling. And she stuck with that vision, even when getting pressured to leave the character of my adult self out of the whole play. There's three versions of me in the play: a child, a college age, and an adult. Another weird, very surreal thing to see myself in triplicate on the stage. But some people were trying to tell her, that older person doesn't work, get rid of her, but she didn't. All right. So it's now been 55 years since Stonewall, but I feel like we are very much at risk of getting dragged back to those bad old days. And one example of this is the wave of book challenges and bans and censorship that have been going on in recent years, of which Fun Home has been a frequent target. This memoir about my actual life has been called obscene by people trying to keep it out of high school libraries, like this guy at school board meeting in Missouri who has carefully brought like these blown up visual aids. These 2 pages from Fun Home. In case you can't make that out, here, I'll show you what's happening. It's a scene in the book about the first time I had sex in college. I can't even describe what it feels like to see this kind of insanity going on. The closest I can get is that it reminds me of a cartoon I did a long time ago, which was called Lesbophobia, as a catalog of fears that are specific to lesbians, like taffetaphobia. But the school board thing totally reminds me of this one. Fear of your exploits at the queer pride march being captured in a religious right propaganda video. It's crazy. And actually the only reason this particular school board ban came to my attention out of the many that are happening is because not long after this meeting, this guy was arrested on 3 counts of child molestation. I don't mean to suggest that these people are all child molesters, even though that's what they claim about the brave teachers and librarians who dare to make challenged books available, calling them groomers. These people, okay, I'm sorry. I'm trying to eliminate the phrase "these people" from my vocabulary. It doesn't help, but still, they make me so mad. Thank God this story about 2 male penguins, true story about 2 male penguins who raise a chick together, just got put back on the shelves in Florida, where the group Moms for Liberty had gotten it removed. But things still feel very perilous. One of the things I started to learn about when I was just coming out, way back in the last century, was that there had been this great flowering of queer culture in Weimar, Berlin, between the world wars. I thought of gay rights as a very new, modern thing, so I was surprised to learn that this had been going on back in the 1920s. I was especially interested to learn that Berlin even had a gay library, Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Research. So I'm a bit loath to bring up Hitler, since in our current state of LOL, nothing matters, public discourse, it risks just desensitizing us all further, but I'm sorry, I just want to connect some historical dots. When the Nazis came to power, one of their most vividly symbolic actions was to raid Hirschfeld's library and burn all those books in a public bonfire, one of a series of book burnings targeting gay books, leftist books, Jewish books, anything that they found disturbing. So even as I have watched this incredible progress our movement has made over the last 4 decades, I really, far beyond anything I had imagined, I have kept asking myself in the back of my head, is this going to stick? Or could we lose everything again? Just like that, could everything go up in flames again? I don't have to tell you, things are looking a little dicey. This is some lunatic running for Congress last year. When gay marriage turned out to not send the nation into a death spiral, conservatives found a new target in trans people. And there's now just hundreds of anti-LGBTQ bills pending in states all across the country, many of them focused on the most vulnerable people of all, trans youth. So the thing about book bans is it's not so much books as people who are the target. The books getting challenged are very disproportionately by Black and LGBTQ authors, about Black and queer characters, and geared to a young adult audience. Ta-Nehisi Coates, last year's Chubb Fellow, has pointed out that writers with subjugated identities don't just have to use their imaginations in the usual way all writers do. They have to reimagine. They have to undo and think past the ways they've been taught to hate themselves. But when writers are able to do that, so are their readers. Book bans aren't just hurting the Black and queer kids who can't get these books out of the library, they're hurting all the kids. One of the reasons people read is in order to understand the perspective of others, for God's sakes, which is maybe the most deeply human thing we do. One particular way that book bans affect queer people is that we're different from other kinds of marginalized groups in that we don't in general learn who we are from our families. Historically, one of the ways we've learned about ourselves is from books, and that was certainly true for me. I'm going to read you a very short passage from Fun Home about that period in college when I was doing all of that desperate reading. My realization at age 19 that I was a lesbian came about in a manner consistent with my bookish upbringing, a revelation not of the flesh, but of the mind. I'd been having qualms since I was 13 when I first learned the word due to its alarming prominence in my dictionary. But now another book, a book about people who had completely cast aside their own qualms, elaborated on that definition. That first volume led quickly to others. A few days later, I screwed up my courage and bought one. This book referred to other books, which I sought out in the library. Then one day it occurred to me I could actually look up homosexuality in the card catalog. I found a 4-foot trove in the stacks, which I quickly ravished. And soon I was trolling even the public library, heedless of the risks. I want to point out something I only learned recently. Elsa, this gray-haired woman in the book I had read back in 1979, her name was Elsa Gidlow, and she was a poet. I just found out that she actually traveled to Berlin in her youth specifically to go to the Institute for Sexual Research library to learn more about who she was, which I think is a very vivid reminder that the past is never dead, and 1932 is not that far away. So I've been talking about truth. In Dykes to Watch Out For, I set out to tell the truth about myself. In Fun Home, it was the truth of my family. I went on to write another memoir after that called Are You My Mother?, which was about seeing even deeper and more accurately into my family's dynamics, and trying to figure out how therapy, by helping us to accurately see what was going on in our families, can liberate us. And my most recent book, on the surface, is about my lifelong relationship with exercise, but on a deeper level, it's about learning to inhabit the truth of my body and my emotions, which in my family I'd gotten cut off from very early on. This book is about how I discovered that physical exertion was a way of getting outside of the shell of my individual self, of quieting my overactive mind as I focused more on my body. It's also about my forays into meditation and Buddhism, and learning that Buddhism has something in common with therapy. Both practices are about getting at the truth, about learning to see things as they are. In fact, the Buddha might be the original woke person. The word Buddha literally means awakened one, or that which has become aware. But in the case of Buddhism, it's a waking up to the very nature of reality, to the reality of impermanence and change and mortality, but also the way that everything is connected and the way our individual selves melt away once you see that. The title comes from this ad I saw in the back of a comic book when I was little. I was very obsessed as a child with all those bodybuilding ads I would see in my comic books, especially the ones about the weakling at the beach who gets sand kicked on him and then builds himself up with the Charles Atlas program. But the book is ultimately about how that kind of self-fortification is not strength at all, but the opposite. So I feel increasingly like taking the trouble to sort out what is true, to see things as they are, is an inherently progressive act and vision. It's a difficult and painful process, but it's never as painful as not doing it, or as dangerous as it is to deny the truth of history. And it's that very notion of truth that the MAGA Republicans are attacking as they fire hose us with one lie after another until no one can keep track anymore. They would rather destroy this complex, interdependent, multicultural, pluralistic democracy than share it. So there's no sugarcoating it. We are in danger of a disastrous slide backwards, and we all have to do whatever we can to get Kamala Harris elected. I'm gonna just take a brief, I don't even feel like that's a political thing to say. I know I'm talking about politics, but it's not. I just want to try and lighten the mood a tad before I wind up by giving you a sneak peek of what I've been working on lately. I'm writing a book that's sort of a mashup of a memoir and my old comic strip, but it's a fictional memoir about a cartoonist named Alison Bechdel who lives on a pygmy goat sanctuary, which I don't really do. I don't even have one pygmy goat. I'm just making this all up, which is great fun after all the years I've spent trying to tell the exact truth about my life. I had to invent all of these goat characters. In the book, Alison became well known for writing a memoir not about her father, the funeral director, but about her father, the taxidermist, which got turned not into a Broadway musical, but into a prestige TV series. It was very fun to cast that. Her sister has gone full MAGA. Here's one of her sister's Facebook posts. She's basically joined Moms for Liberty and is trying to get Alison's book banned. But the really fun part of all this for me is that in this book, Alison's friends are the Dykes to Watch Out For characters. And they're all, like me, now in their 60s. They have kids in college. They're playing playing pickleball, raising chickens. So this has been a lot of fun in these darkish days. But I would like to end by reading the very ending of Fun Home to you, which relates to the censorship theme, as you will see. So I started writing. I have to set a few things up before I read it. Something I've realized just recently in the middle of all this book banning mania is that, in a way, what Fun Home is really about is not me or my dad or coming out or family at all. It's about books. Books and reading. Books as a currency and a mode of connection. Fun Home is bookended by references to James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist and Ulysses, two of the books that serve as conduits between my father and me. As a kid, my dad and I would play the airplane game, and I link this via Joyce to the story of Icarus and Daedalus, the old artificer and inventor who made the wings so his son could fly. So the book opens with my dad and me playing this game together. And this gets mirrored at the end by another physical interaction with my father that is related to it, this moment of learning to jump off a diving board. And one thing that happens in this final chapter of the book is that my dad gives me his college copy of Ulysses when I was in college and about to take a class on it. My father taught high school English, and he was always trying to get me to read things. And I usually refused because I had to rebel in some way or other, and that was how I did it. But I was feeling charitable on this particular evening. This interaction happened in this funny brief window of time between November, when I came out to myself, and February, when I came out to my family. So when this scene happened, I knew I was a lesbian, but my father didn't. But I was feeling so open to him that night that I actually asked him for a suggestion, for something else to read. And he gave me This book, a copy of the French writer Colette's memoirs, which I soon found went into riveting detail about the underground lesbian scene in Paris in the 1920s. Okay, so now I'm going to read this passage to you. In one of my father's courtship letters to my mother, he praises something she'd written in her last letter to him by comparing it to James Joyce. In a telling mistake, Dad imputes the beseeching eyes to Leopold Bloom instead of to his wife Molly. But how could he admire Joyce's lengthy, libidinal yes so fervently and end up saying no to his own life? I suppose that a lifetime spent hiding one's erotic truth could have a cumulative renunciatory effect. Sexual shame is in itself a kind of death. Ulysses, of course, was banned for many years by people who found its honesty obscene. The front matter of my modern library edition includes the decision by the judge who lifted the ban in 1933, along with a letter from Joyce to Random House detailing Ulysses' publication history to date. He mentions that Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap were prosecuted for running episodes in their magazine, The Little Review. He acknowledges the risks Sylvia Beach took in publishing a manuscript no one else would touch. Perhaps it's just a coincidence that these women, along with Sylvia's lover, Adrienne Monnier, who published the French edition of Ulysses, were all lesbians. But I like to think they went to the mat for this book because they were lesbians, because they knew a thing or two about erotic truth. Erotic truth is a rather sweeping concept. I shouldn't pretend to know what my father's was. Perhaps my eagerness to claim him as gay in the way I am gay, as opposed to bisexual or some other category, is just a way of keeping him to myself, a sort of inverted Oedipal complex. I think of his letter, the one where he does and doesn't come out to me. It's exactly the disavowal Stephen Dedalus makes at the beginning of Ulysses, Joyce's nod to the novel's mock-heroic method. In the end, Joyce broke his contract with Beach and sold Ulysses to Random House for a tidy sum. He did not offer to repay her for the financial sacrifices she'd made for his book. Beach put a good face on it, writing, "A baby belongs to its mother, not to the midwife, doesn't it?" And as long as we're likening Ulysses to a child, it fared much better than Joyce's actual children. But I suppose this is consistent with the book's theme that spiritual, not physical, paternity is the important thing. Is it so unusual for the two things to coincide? What if Icarus hadn't hurtled into the sea? What if he'd inherited his father's inventive bent? What might he have wrought? He did hurtle into the sea, of course, but in the tricky reverse narration that impels our entwined stories, he was there to catch me when I leapt. Okay, that's the end of my talk. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. That's very kind of you. I'm happy to answer some questions if people have things they would like to ask. There's two students with mics who will run around and find folks. So raise your hand if you have anything you'd like to talk. There's someone way back there in a green shirt.
Hi, my name is Soph. Thank you so much. I'm particularly moved right now after seeing your upcoming work because I feel so close to all of those characters, and seeing them older is so special, especially because I see my community and all of my friends in those faces as well. And
thank you.
I was hit by that.
That's so cool.
But thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for all your work. And my question is about family. Your work explores both biological and chosen family. And I'm curious of how do you see queer and familial lineages as intersecting and entangled? How is joy and trauma inherited in family lineage, whether it's biological or chosen or some mix of the two?
Oh my God,
Thank you
what
so
an amazing
much.
question. That sounds like a dissertation topic. I think you just kind of covered it all there. And that's interesting. I never really thought about the fact that I write about both biological and chosen family, but of course that's all I've done. The concept of being able to select your own family was really salvational for me as a young person, as it is for many gay people. But of course, eventually, I realized it would help to come to terms with my family as well. And I don't know. I feel like I can't think of an answer to that question as smart as the question itself. I love that you used the word joy. I think it's always important to follow the joy, because it's a good indication of what's healthy, what's good for everyone. And to, if something feels bad, go the other way. Family is I guess I don't really have anything coherent to say about that. I'm sorry. I've been working really hard. I'm not only starting to teach for the first time, which is so hard. I don't know how people do it. Oh my God, it's like some kind of physical endurance event. But I'm also working on this book, and every spare moment I have, I'm drawing that book, and now I've been preparing this talk, and I'm sorry, I just kind of blanked out. I feel like I might not be very useful in the Q&A section here today. Here's someone down front.
I hope this question is easier. You said that in your work, you said that a lot of your work has been trying to capture the truth about your life, and I just wanted to ask if you personally feel like you've captured it.
Do I personally feel like I have captured the truth of my life? Well, not the entire truth. I don't think anyone wants to hear that. But that's the trick, is finding out how much is relevant and important to share and how much is oversharing. I think memoirists all have to grapple with that. You certainly you want people to want to know more about you, not wish that you'd stopped telling them things a long time ago. And I feel like in some funny way I'm trying to obfuscate some of the truth of my life by writing this fake memoir. Like you thought you knew who I was, but maybe I have a goat farm. I know, there's something sort of therapeutic for me in sort of blurring the lines a little bit. I think when I was young, I didn't understand the long-reaching implications of telling this story. I knew it was a big deal to tell this family story, revealing these secrets about my parents, but it's continued to have all kinds of repercussions that I could not possibly have foreseen. I wouldn't change anything, but it's a big thing to take on and then live with, especially as this story kind of remains static and my life has changed and the things I know about my parents have changed, and the story would be very different if I wrote it now.
Hi, I'm interested in your voice as a narrator that goes through both of your memoirs. Was it hard to find that and keep it consistent? And do you have different ones for different works?
It was hard for me to find that voice, and I do feel like the voices in Fun Home and Are You My Mother are pretty different. Fun Home is more, I use a lot of big words, I use a lot of sort of rhetorical flourishes, but in Are You My Mother, I feel like I try to not do that so much, to keep the prose more spare and simple. And that wasn't so much a conscious choice. I think that they both evolved sort of organically out of my relationships to those particular parents. My father was this flamboyant artist, and that language seemed to suit him. It took me a while to hit on it, though. Like, there's a sort of ironic distance almost in the narrator's voice in Fun Home, which is not there with the book about my mother, I don't think. I don't know, it's just like the work of writing. I had to figure out, how do people write books? I had no idea. Thank you. Hi.
Okay. Hi, my name is Haley Love. Thank you so much for allowing me to ask you this question. I don't know if this mic is on. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm really interested in your pursuit of storytelling through different mediums, and particularly your decision to abstain from getting involved with Fun Home as a musical. What went into the decision-making to kind of sign away your rights, and why would you kind of make that decision knowing how important it is to you to make sure that your stories are represented authentically and correctly?
That's a really good question, because there had been a film offer, like someone wanted to option the film rights for Fun Home, and I didn't exactly refuse, but I asked for a lot more money than they were offering. I decided I would ask for, what was my soul worth? Like, if they ended up making a really bad movie, how much money would make me feel okay about it? And they weren't, they weren't willing to pay me that much money, which I was fine with, great. But for some reason, the idea of a musical, as I said, I don't really know much. I wasn't a person who knew a lot about musicals. Now I know there's like this whole cult of people, and that's their religion. But I didn't know about that. And it felt like such an alien form to me that I didn't have any stake in it. Like, if it didn't represent me accurately, I somehow wouldn't feel as betrayed. I know now that a bad musical would have been a terrible thing, and I was very, very lucky it didn't turn out bad. And I don't think it was even an option for me to be involved. I suppose I could have tried to argue for that, but I don't think they wanted me messing around with it. And I knew that I knew nothing about constructing a play, so I just stayed out of it. Who? This fellow right behind you here.
The last time you spoke here, you projected a drawing of the general store in West Barnet, Vermont. And that store no longer exists, but I remember it very well, and your drawing was absolutely accurate. Every detail, quite unnecessarily accurate, it seemed to me. And I wondered if the accuracy in your work is an aesthetic obligation, an ethical one, a political one. I discovered the same thing in the map of your hometown in Fun Home. I could navigate with it just like with Google Earth. They were identical.
What a great question. Yeah, I do feel like there's something ethical in that level of detail. What were the other options? Ethical, aesthetic. But also, I'm trying to prove that I'm reliable as a narrator. That's important. But also, the level of detail in my work changed drastically with technology. You know, I didn't used to be able to. I only could find those images of the Barnett General Store because of the internet. And I spend, probably a third of my drawing time is just me surfing the internet looking for stuff like that. And I consider it now part of drawing. I'm looking for images that, they're going to add to my story in some way, add verisimilitude, add texture. I think it can easily go awry. I often have to just stop myself, like, oh my God, are you crazy? Just stop, this is fine. But I think that's one of the basic things cartoonists do, is you have to navigate this line between simplifying the world into a black and white cartoon or a color cartoon, and getting enough detail in it to make it resonant for people. And it's just like a tightrope I'm always teetering on. But I'm so glad you appreciated that picture of the general store. Over here, this right down in the front. Hi, Evelyn.
Hi. Well, can you hear me? Okay. First of all, I think you're doing a great job as a professor, so I think you don't have to, I don't think you have to, you're all good. So great work. Second of all, I think a question that I've been grappling with as an artist and a storyteller is when you're telling a story about people in your life and about a story that's really personal to you and important to you. Something you also mentioned was it affects real people in your life. And it's something that I've been thinking when writing about the personal and things that are important in that way. How did you grapple with the question of telling a narrative and a story that is genuine to the way that you saw it and to your memory, and genuine to your perspective, while at the same time sort of, how did you grapple the question of this is going to affect real people, and sometimes maybe things will be portrayed differently?
Well, I try to engage in a process with people I write about. I certainly did that with my mother, but she had a kind of arm's length attitude. She didn't want to be implicated in the process, so she was like, she had a few things she asked me to change, but mostly she was like, that's your story, your version, whatever. But I've written about other people in more recent books, like ex-girlfriends and stuff, and I've gotten into this process with them, like, do you remember this? This is how I'm writing about it. Is this okay with you? And I'll get back some completely different version. Like, no, not at all. You make me look like an idiot here. What are you? And I've had to go through this really interesting and I think productive process of, like, investigating my own. I'm not an infallible narrator. I remember things in a way that makes me look good. So it's a very useful exercise to kind of militate against that and to keep reminding myself that I'm not the authority on my own past. But that's also hard to do and taxing, especially if you're writing something and you're on deadline. Do you really want to stop and have like a processing session with your ex about? But I think it's all part of the process, and it's part of that ethical compact. You can't just write, lies about people. Here, yeah.
First of all, can you hear me?
Yes, you're a little muffled, but I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. I do want to say Fun Home is 100% the most transformational work of art, I think, in my family's life, because I read that book. I came to it because it reminded me of my parents. My dad's not gay, just an adulterer, but I gave it to my younger sibling and I said, you have to read this. These are our parents. And they came back and they said, no, this is me. I'm a lesbian. And so you were there, Colette. And quite apart from that personal connection, I just wanted to ask, I noticed that you write about your father and your mother with both, closeness and distance in both instances, where your father was your gay parent and your mother was your female parent, and you were kind of straddling both of those identities. So I wanted to ask about how you negotiate that sense of similarity and separation from both of them in your writing.
Wow, yeah, that's a great question. Because obviously they're both part of me, and as we're all part of our parents. Such a strange relationship, that we're actually made of other people. I don't know if I have much more to add to what you said. I think, I don't know. It's interesting. I'm working with my students. I think they're be telling their they're going to be writing their own comics, and I suspect some of them are going to be autobiographical, and I look forward to, articulating more of this stuff with them, which I haven't ever done. I've just done it. I haven't really thought about it, and certainly haven't taught it. So we'll see how that goes, Evelyn. I'm sort of unnerved to see at least one of my students here. Like, I feel like my identities are collapsing. Over here in the black mask.
Thanks. I'm curious, as a person who has watched the contours of queer life change really dramatically over the last several decades, are there things you miss and that you hope we find again that used to feel really rich?
I really do miss the sense of cohesive community that I once had. I know that we had that because it was us against the world, and I don't want to go back to that, but there was something marvelous about just feeling that intensity of connection with people. So I do miss that. And I don't know how you get that back, especially as you're getting older and the culture is changing, and I don't often experience that. I get little glimpses now and then and at certain events, but nothing sustained. So yeah, good question. Where are the mic people? Down front here. I can't pick. I can't even hardly see people. Why don't you just go.
Hi, does
Hi.
this still work? Can you hear me?
Yes. I don't think that's on, but I can hear you.
Okay.
You can just pretend.
Okay, so my question has to do with your creative practice. I'm a musician, and I have to study music a lot every day. And so I'm wondering, what does your day look like? Do you have a method of, I wake up at this time and I work on my book from this time to this time every day? In your last memoir, you were losing sleep, missing your deadline or trying to meet your deadline. And so that was very relatable to me because I procrastinate and I work up to the deadline, and I'm wondering if on your best days when you find yourself the most disciplined in your practice, what does that routine look like to you?
Oh, what a good question. When I'm most disciplined is when I'm on a deadline and it's kind of life or death, literally. I wish I could not procrastinate. I wish I could work more steadily all along than having these crushing burdens at the end of a project. But I think turning yourself over to a creative project is necessarily all-consuming, and much as I love that and enjoy it, I don't want to leave my life. I love just hanging out, watching TV, going for a walk, and so I put it off, and then I get to the state where there is no time to do anything but the work, and it's crazy. And I'm 64. Why have I not learned to manage this stuff better? Maybe it's just the way it has to be. I don't know. But ideally, on a good day, I love that my work is kind of hybrid. Like I will write in the morning, sitting at my computer, and then when my morning fresh brain goes away, as it does around noon, it gets earlier and earlier with each passing year, then I move over to drawing, which I don't need the same kind of attention for. It's more of a physical thing. And I love that bifurcation of my day. And I'm just working all day long. This woman here with the hijab.
Hello, can you hear me? I hope this mic is working. So first of all, I do want to say thank you so much for the wonderful lecture. I first came across Fun Home as a junior in high school, and one of the things that we talked about a lot and something that kind of fundamentally changed my life was how you used allusion to mythology and mysticality, something that you see in James Joyce's work, and also the artifice of Icarus and Daedalus. And I was wondering if you still kind of find that applicable now. Do you still find something to be said? Do you still find a connection between mythology and mysticality in today's politics and contemporary work, even when it seems so different now from when you first published Fun Home? And yeah, thank you so much.
I think that mythology is just all around us. You know, these ancient themes are constantly being reenacted and manifested everywhere in the political situation, in the culture, and that's the great power of them. And of course, they're always kind of subtly changing, too. I didn't really set out to do that in Fun Home. It just kind of found me as I tried to learn more about my father and started reading the books that he loved as a way of doing that. These themes just started kind of taking over my own writing, and I think that they're all there for us to access and use as we need to. Okay, let's do one more question. That was a very good one, though. Thank you. Right here, this guy.
Hi, thank you for the talk. So I'm a biologist as my job here, but I also am an editorial cartoonist. And so, as you know, like cartoons carry a profound power to impact like people's opinions, to impact politics and stuff. And I remember the cartoon that I drew where I had that realization. So I was wondering if there was a particular cartoon where you realize like how much power and persuasion you have over people through your art.
Oh, that's a good question. You know, I never really considered myself an editorial cartoonist. That felt like such a very different enterprise, and I admired the people who could do that. An editorial strain came into my work over time, but it took me a while to develop enough sense of authority to be able to do that. So I don't have one moment. For me, it was like building up this world that people could relate to and that would not so much change things. I wanted to like give the people who are out there actually doing the work some entertainment, something to like reflect them and amuse them, and for all the hard work that they were doing. So I wasn't so much thinking about the change, although I think that was a side effect in the end. Okay, thank you all very, very, very much.